as we proceed. So hello, everyone. My name is Fuad Maki. I'm on the faculty of the Department of Global Development and currently the director of the Poston Institute for Global Development, which is sponsoring today's event. The Poston Institute was established in 2001 to sponsors conferences, seminars, workshops, and research working groups to advance critical and collaborative research on a range of pressing issues related to development, from global inequality to the determinants and dynamics of global climate change. The theme of today's webinar, The Making of Global China, in many ways exemplifies the kinds of research the Institute seeks to facilitate. And we're particularly delighted to have Professor Ching Kwan Lee, a distinguished scholar of China, with us today. Professor Lee is a professor of sociology at UCLA, who is interested in global and comparative issues, from the development of the global south to the dynamics of globalization and work. She's the author of 3 multiple award-winning monographs on China, Gender and the South China Miracle, 2 Worlds of Factory Women, which was published in 1998, Against the Law, Labor Protests in China's Rustbelt and Sunbelt, published in 2007, and The Specter of Global China, Politics, Labor, and Foreign Investment in Africa, 2017. Professor Lee is also co-editor of 2 books published in 2019, Take Back Our Future and Eventful Sociology of the Hong Kong Umbrella Movement, published by Cornell University Press, and The Social Question in the 21st Century, A Global View from the University of California Press. I'm also delighted to introduce 2 of my colleagues who will be engaging in a conversation with Professor Lee today and moderating the discussion after. Eli Friedman, who is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Comparative and International Labor at Cornell University. He's the author of Insurgency Trap, Labor Politics in Post-Socialist China, published in 2014, and The Urbanization of People, the Politics of Development, Labor Markets, and Schooling in the Chinese City, which will be out this spring. Jenny Goldstein is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Development and a core faculty member of Cornell's Southeast Asian Studies program. She works across the areas of political ecology, critical development studies, and human geography, and is co-editor of the forthcoming volume, The Nature of Data, Infrastructures, Environments, Politics. So the basic format of the webinar is they will have a 3-way conversation for about an hour, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fuad. And thank you, CK, for joining us. It's really wonderful to have you here at Cornell for however many times you've joined us at Cornell. We appreciate your company always. So we've got a pretty broad-ranging audience here, I think, today. Some, of course, from the Department of Global Development, and some from the probably East Asian community at Cornell and elsewhere who have particular expertise in China, others who don't at all. So speaking sort of to both sets of expertise, I wonder if you could maybe start off by just talking to us about this idea of global China. So what is it, right? How did you sort of arrive at studying it, and unpack it for us as a phenomenon?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Maki, and for Jenny and Eli for having me today. I mean, these days, you wake up every day and you're just bombarded with all sorts of horrific and depressing news, and it just strikes me as such a treat to be invited to have a serious intellectual conversation, but as well as having a reunion with students I worked with in the past and now who are professors in their own right. And so this is very gratifying and comforting in these very treacherous times. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And so I'd like to, as Jenny said, I'd like to unpack a little bit this notion of global China, because it is with us every day in the news. And there's so many different facets, dimensions of this phenomenon. So what I like to propose is to think of global China under 3 different levels to begin this conversation. So, and they belong to different levels of abstraction. The first level, of course, we could understand global China as this empirical phenomenon that China has become a global force. And we read about it in news, in international news every day, reports about the Belt and Road, and more recently about all the debt traps that China is allegedly imposing on many African or third world countries. We read about stories of Chinese direct investment in mines in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. We read about grand strategies that the Chinese government gives all sorts of very fancy names, the branding of their policies, like going out, the Belt and Road, of course, but also Made in China 2025. And beyond the economic activities, we also read a lot about China's activities, other kinds of activities in different parts of the world and in different arenas of world affairs. So for instance, climate change, digital technology. China is a big major exporter of digital surveillance technology. China is also engaged in all kinds of diplomacy. We're in COVID times now, so vaccines become the tool of China's soft power export, trying to build a good image of a lovable, respectable, friendly China. And also in institution building. So the Asia AIIB, the banks that is led by China to provide finance to build infrastructures around the world. So the first level is really about this phenomenon that we read on the empirical level. China is going out big time as a global force, shaping and doing a lot of things around the world. And I would just want to, at this point, just remind people there's a lot of factual errors being reported, circulated online and into international press, even for by very reputable venues like The Economist, the Financial Times, let alone, sometimes the New York Times as well. So be careful when you read that. And I think I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Deborah Brautingham at Johns Hopkins, who've really done a lot in sort of debunking and demystifying, correcting many of these misinformation. But that's the first level. To think about global China is the things that we read about Chinese activities in different domains, in different parts of the world as grand strategies. But I like to spend a little bit more time on the second and a third level or dimensions of global China. The second level is to think of global China analytically, not so much in terms of Chinese policies bearing the names of Belt and Road or the Confucius Institutes, and also not to think in terms of geography, in the sense of China going out of China, going into the world. This analytical level thinks of global China as a power phenomenon, not policy, not geography, but power, as a bundle of power, generic power mechanisms that China deploys in perhaps very Chinese ways in pursuing its project of outward expansion. So, and I recently wrote about 3 major mechanisms, power mechanisms that I have identified. These are generic power mechanisms that China deploys in its own specific ways. And these are economic statecraft, patron clientelism, symbolic domination. And I'll give examples of these in a minute. But I just want to flag why I think is tremendously productive to think of global China in these power terms, and rather than in very empirical terms of Chinese policies. And the first advantage is that when you think of global China as a phenomenon, as a power phenomenon, and think in terms of those specific power processes, methods, if you want, then you begin to think, what are the processes? How do they do it? How do they project those powers? How do they make economic statecraft work? And that implies that we'll be focusing our attention, not so much on the Belt and Road and how much money China spent on that, on Belt and Road, but we begin to ask questions about agency. Who are actually doing, who are the foot soldiers doing these projects? What are their interests? Why are they willing to go out? And through what method, that is the how question, do they go out? And in the process, producing what kind of consequences? And because power is relational, if we think about global China as a power phenomenon, then we would necessarily attend to not just the China side of China's going out, but the receiving side of Chinese policies, because it's relational. China, if China can become a global power, then why are people letting it become a global power? So we begin to think of global China as a power phenomenon. That means a relational phenomenon. That means we'll be thinking about resistance, bargaining, accommodation, appropriation, and adaptation by those targets of global China. And I think that's what I've done with my last book, The Specter of Global China, which is to look at when China arrives in Africa, in this case, Zambia, how did African or Zambian elite and workers and ordinary citizens, civil society, voters there react to that? What kind of interest do they have in interacting with China? And so that's, I can go into that a little bit later, but that's the first advantage of thinking about global China as a power phenomenon, is that it opens up many more questions. The second advantage is when you focus on Belt and Roads, for instance, instead of economic statecraft, you would single out China because only China has this policy of Belt and Road. But economic statecraft is a generic tool for big powers to exert their influence around the world, and not China alone practicing it. And so I think there's tremendous advantage to think in terms of generic power, a mechanism that China is using, giving it the name Belt and Road, but thinking in terms of economic statecraft with this generic power method or strategy, we would begin to see that actually the West has been practicing the equivalent of Belt and Road for many decades. Think about, the World Bank and IMF. They were the first ones to give loans to third world countries and use that economic means to achieve political and diplomatic goals. So we've all learned about structural adjustment that came as conditions to IMF and World Bank loans to third world countries and forced them to adopt neoliberalism. And if we complain about China setting up debt traps or using loans to buy its way into these countries, I think we should think about the West doing it, and China is copying what the West has been doing for so long. So I think thinking in terms of not policy, but in terms of power, allow us to see a bigger picture of which China is only a part. And it's the same thing with Confucius Institutes. Of course, only China has set up Confucius Institutes around the world. But as an example of symbolic domination, that is trying to assert influence, project influence by changing, by mobilizing culture and symbols to change our view of the world, to change our common sense, our disposition, our habits of thought, habits of feelings, naming and classification of reality. These are by no means unique Chinese ways of power. China is using the Confucius Institute to pursue a very generic form of power. And again, thinking in generic terms and think about how China uses it in specific Chinese ways, help us to render a more accurate picture about China's particular way of going abroad and become a world power, but also how not unique, how generic, and how other forces, how other countries have actually tried to become a global force using similar technologies of power. So I think that's the second level, which is, I think of global China as a bundle of power mechanisms, and not just in empirical terms of the amount of money, the amount of projects, and how many mines, how many ports that China had built, which is the first level, the empirical level. So the second level is this level of thinking of global China as a power phenomenon with both generic and Chinese specific features, and thinking in those terms open up comparative questions, open up relational questions, open up questions of resistance to China, as opposed to just talk about, oh, billions of dollars from China to Africa. That must mean that Africa is becoming subjugated to China, without even thinking what is the other side of the relationship for China in Africa. So that's the second level, the analytical level. And the third level is to think of global China as a method. And what this means is to see not China going out, but what happens in China, domestic China, is also shaped and constituted by global forces. And I think this is a good way to overcome what in China studies has long been a kind of methodological nationalism that has plagued China studies and all area studies and social science in general, which tend to reify national boundaries. And so what does that mean then? I'll give you one example to think of global China as a method of studying a country in global and transnational terms. This morning, I just taught my undergraduate class on global China, and we've been talking about Xinjiang. And Xinjiang is now in the news a lot and has been this kind of contentious issue about human rights violation by China, attracting sanctions by the US and condemnation around the world. What happened in Xinjiang is the digital surveillance system, forced labor in cotton fields, and of course factories, garment factories, as well as concentration camps targeting Muslims. Now, all these happen within China. And we tend to think of it as a China kind of atrocity committed by China. All this is true. It has happened within the territory of China. And Beijing is, of course, responsible and rightly condemned for what it has done to Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But a global China perspective as a method will open up the question of what? Will open up the question that China is not the only actor, because all these atrocities that we think are committed by China have actually been assisted by many global actors, among which are US research universities and tech giants, which help China to perfect the surveillance system and sort of groom this industry that now China exports to the rest of the world. US research universities, UW, Microsoft, their former employees, their subsidiaries, all these are business partners to the industries that make possible Xinjiang as a surveillance state and penal, the world's largest open penal, a digital prison. And also the cotton fields and factories. There's a global market and supply chain that helps China, that actually sort of produce these incentives for China to imprison and use the Uyghurs as forced labor. So we have to see that what happened in Xinjiang is part of this global capitalist market and supply chain and the system of subjugating marginalized people as workers, as laborers, that sustained the cotton field and that sustained the kind of atrocities in China. And last but not the least, the anti-terrorism rhetoric that Beijing has been using. They call it the People's War on Terror. It is exactly out of the playbook of the Bush administration and the US administrations thereafter, after 9/11. And when we complain about the China imprisoning its Uyghur population, are we not forgetting Guantanamo that is still operating today as we speak? That has been in operation for more than 2 decades. And China's copying this rhetoric of war on terror in legitimizing what it's doing in Xinjiang. So China is co-opting this global narrative and imagination. So all these global forces go in making of Chinese policies within China. Now, this is only just one example. We can go on to a lot more in Q&A if you want. But the third perspective of thinking about global China as a notion is really not as a phenomenon empirically that you read in the newspapers and under the rubrics of all those fancy policy grand strategies, and not only as analytical tools, those power mechanisms that other countries have used, but China is using in particular ways, but also as a methodological reminder that oftentimes national boundaries are reified by the governments themselves, by ourselves, identifying as by nationalities. And a lot of the phenomena that are happening in China, they actually are global, and which means that the PRC, China, as we understand it, is constituted through and through by many global interests, forces, dynamics, ideologies, imaginations, and so on and so forth. So even if you're only interested in China within China, you need to take into perspective and analyze the global in order to understand domestic China. So this is the third level at which I use the term global China, so 3 levels. So I'm sorry, this is a long answer to Jenny's first question, and I promise not to take up so much time in subsequent questions, but I think it's important for us to lay out and have this more comprehensive view for a term that we use for today's event when we want to unpack or think about the making of global China. What are we talking about? We're at least talking about 3 levels, and there could be more.
I can ask a follow-up, and I know I'm cutting into Eli's airtime here, but I think it's relevant at this point. So in the Specter of Global China, your last monograph book, you make the argument in the introduction, and you return to it in the conclusion very clearly, that you're pushing back against other scholars or even journalists that have called China a neo-colonial power or categorized their actions abroad outside of China's sort of nation state boundaries as colonial activities. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, about why you don't think colonialism right or neo-colonialism is the right analytical category to be describing here, and why that might be the case.
Right, and well, there are a lot of reasons. First of all, because a lot of people use the term colonialism and neocolonialism in a very loose, kind of moralizing way as a general critique and condemnation, without really specifying what the terms mean to them. Is it because we don't like one big country going into another country and create this kind of dependency relationship? And if it is dependency that we're against, and that is the phenomenon that we are targeting, we are trying to describe with neocolonialism, then we have to be very specific, because which country, you ask yourself in this world, in this day and age of global interdependence, which country is dependent on other countries? So dependency obviously is not unique to China's relation to other countries. To me, colonialism has a specific threshold. I would call something colonial, and that's the term I would apply to Hong Kong, China's relation to Hong Kong, is when a country can impose or transplant institutions to another society. That I would think qualifies the term colonialism. Historically, and derived from that in the contemporary world. And if we're just talking about economic exchanges, there's this unequal relationship. One side is more dependent on another. I think China is not the only country that has kind of asymmetrical economic relationship. And then you can say, well, we call everybody neocolonial then. Yes, we can. But has it lost meaning? Would it lose any particular punch when you use it in such a general way? So I like to push for a more concise and precise, actually, accurate description of highlighting what is China doing, what can it accomplish? Now, the other objection to using colonialism or neocolonialism is I just find it hard to see any concrete evidence to substantiate the influence of China to the extent that I could see and say there is a stable relationship of a colonial master over a colonial subject in any sovereign state in Africa or Asia, you name it. I mean, maybe the audience can think of some examples and we can debate about it. Now, beyond that, if you use in a very liberal way the term neocolonialism, we're just exaggerating what China has been doing, has been able to accomplish. Maybe Beijing or Xi Jinping has neocolonial imperial ambition, but that stays at the ambition state. From ambition to accomplishment, there's a big gap there that we need to step in and as scholars to examine. Has Beijing been able to realize is imperialistic or colonialist or neo-colonialist ambition? Or is it just because of all these reports that emphasizes the amount of money it has spent in building this or throwing around or developing the mines that would create this impression, and which has totally been divorced from reality? And you look at under the ground and you see a lot of resistance, and China is being beat back at some of those projects. And FT has put out a lot of reports about how many of these high-speed rail projects that were part of the Belt and Road have stopped. They have been abandoned. Nobody report about them. And Deborah Rottingham has followed up many of these reports and found that they never exist in the first place, some of them. The term neocolonialism is very emotional and is very critical. And I understand that sentiment, but as scholars, I think we need better alternatives and we better get serious about what we say. Otherwise, we participate in that creation of an illusion that China is not as powerful as we think it is. And that's part of the reason why I don't like that term, but there are other reasons as well.
Want to take a step back, and I really appreciated the three levels at which we can think of the problem. So the last level being the methodological is a really important insight, and this critique of methodological nationalism applied to China studies in particular is particularly important, right? So we have these area studies for historical institutional reasons continue to be sort of plagued by this in various ways. And just thinking as a point of contrast, like nobody thinks it's controversial to study global America, right? Like that's not controversial, but for some reason studying global China creates all kinds of other dilemmas. And I think in a world in which America's relative dominance is clearly declining and China's is increasing, that it is, I mean, it is an empirical reality, right? And so I think that this kind of methodological approach needs to catch up to that. I do want to return though to that first level, which is the empirical. And so China has, since the formation of the PRC, has had connections with all kinds of countries all over the world, has had not just diplomatic relations, but military, economic, et cetera. All that being said, it is clear that over the last decade or two with the going out policy and then with Belt and Road, that there is a sort of quantitative empirical increase in economic activity in particular is the easiest to measure. And so the question to pose to you is why is that happening, right? And there's different kinds of understandings here about this increase, and you've already sort of addressed some of them. One sort of theory out there is that this is neocolonialism, that Xi Jinping is trying to build an empire, and they now have a military base in Djibouti, and they're getting ports all over the world. So there's some sort of geopolitical strategy. There's the argument about overcapacity, right? And the sort of surpluses that have been generated internally, and they're sort of looking for some kind of outlet. You can also take the Chinese government's own rhetoric kind of at face value and say that this is just about win-win development, and they're kind of a benevolent character sharing their development experience with the rest of the world. I'm wondering what you make of all of this, and how to understand this increased global activity.
Right. Thank you, Eli. Yes, that's been increased, but recently, actually, I've seen of scholarship looking back at the many ignored, neglected traffic between Maoist China in the Mao's period, with Africa and other parts of the world, especially because of Black Lives Matter and the US attention to race. Some very exciting studies, new books have come out about Maoism and the connection to people like Du Bois and all these scholars. He has been invited to Beijing. And so there's this China's relation to African-American and Pan-Africanism in the 60s. Maoism as a global phenomenon. So even before the current period, there has been more global exports from China, engagement from China than we've realized. We used to think of that period as China being insulated, the Cold War, but actually with the major white power elite, yes, but in the third world, with the oppressed people in the first world, there has been a lot of traffic in ideas, in revolutionary methods, guerrilla warfare training, and all of that. So, but coming to your question, indeed, by many metrics, we have documented the rising volume of economic exchanges between China and the rest of the world. And the question you pose is why? Why are we seeing it? Now, it's easy to point to Xi Jinping as the person that sort of minded all this, and he has this set button to push, and then everything goes out. But that's not how China works. We China scholars have for, I don't know, many decades, come to realize that China it looks like an authoritarian and extremely centralized system, which is true. That's but only one side of China. The other side is China is very decentralized, very chaotic. What the center said is always actually responded by improvisations at the grassroots. So the China, is always in the driver's seat to realize what it wants. There's a lot of intentions that are being derailed and redirected. Okay, so the question is, we shouldn't just look at a person, no matter how powerful and autocratic he is. We should look at the system, and I think there are two systemic pressures or imperatives that have driven China to go abroad. I would say since around the turn of the millennium, around year 2000 or even a little before that. And these two systemic imperatives or pressures, some would even say crises, have been exacerbated by the 2008 financial crisis. That started in Wall Street. So another reason to really put China into the global perspective, and not to think that they dream up everything in Beijing and then launch it. China is part of the global economy, and so it is susceptible to all the systemic bottleneck pressures and crises that the global system, experience. So what are the two systemic? I mean, vocabulary, we can think of the twin challenges of accumulation and legitimation. Eli mentioned that other people have pointed to the first, which is the accumulation problem, that China has accumulated too much surplus capacity through the 30 years of rapid growth. And the reason for having so much excess productive, redundant excess capacity is because China is exactly not centralized at all. For a long, long time, the local, provincial, and below, these governments from below have been asked by center to grow the economy. We let you spend your surplus, your revenue. And what has happened then is people were obsessed, officials were obsessed with growth rate. And once you have lots of projects, lots of investments, you have growth rates, which allow them to move up their career ladder. And so there's a tremendous interest in the system for local and the many, many competing local governments to build up capacity, even though they don't make money. Now, growth is different from profit. So many of these local guys are asked and are assessed and reevaluated by how much they grow the economy regardless. Nobody measured the profitability, but they are measured against some growth rates. So the result is what? The result is very decentralized, but very energetic, chaotic, anarchic competition to grow your infrastructure, to grow your capacity. They invite foreign investors to come. And as a result, over 30 years, I mean, that's lots of excess capacity and profit is falling. So what do? Well, you let these companies go out. You encourage them to go out to maintain your profit level. 2008 came, and that was a really important, I can't emphasize enough, and you can cross-check with other political economists writing about China. 2008 and the 2 years after that were extremely critical. It marked a paradigm shift in the way Beijing think about accumulation. And that is the fact that they can't just depend on export. They have to move up the technological ladder. And so they need to go out to do Made in China 2025 to acquire quickly those technology. They buy up companies so that they have robotics, for instance. They don't have to reinvent these things from scratch. So they have to push the companies to go out first to protect the profit level and to acquire technology that allows China as a whole, the economy, to go up, to move beyond this export-led stage of development into high-tech production. But 2008 made the surplus capacity problem even worse, because guess what the Chinese government did after 2008? Well, it rolled out a huge stimulus package, allowing these local guys who have already been building up excess capacity to have more loans to build those railroad that become ghost cities. I mean, I'm sure I taught this in my class, the ghost cities in China. They were the result of 2008, the post-2008 financial stimulus that the government rolled out. So after 2008, there's an extra push, extra incentive for the central government to push everybody out. And Xi Jinping around that time, 2012, he came to power, but he personified. He was just a guy, the face behind this very substantial systemic pressure. It's exacerbated by 2008, but predated 2008. And so this is the first imperative, is to overcome this very classical capitalist kind of bottleneck of overcapacity. But in China, it has its own systemic reason for that problem. The second problem is legitimation. Now, we all know the Chinese Communist Party since Tiananmen Square, 1989, it has relied on growth rate, delivering growth as the political legitimacy for a one-party rule. So any time you have a downward turn in growth rate, which happens in after 2008, it translates into a legitimation problem in the eyes of the elite. And so how do you then sustain your legitimacy? Well, nationalism. They have turned to nationalism since 1989, but to sort of regenerate that, there's no better way to tell your people that China can be great in the world. And so going global is another way for the Chinese regime to claim and reinvigorate reinforced that nationalism that it has boosted since 1989. And so you have these twin interrelated systemic incentives and pressures to really go global, to resolve these, if not crises, then challenges of accumulation and legitimation. And it's not just the center. These are the center's calculation. Once you give them the incentive, you have the ministries, you have the bureaucracies, different ministries, different local governments, different state-owned enterprises who have tremendous interest in going out for their own corporate, departmental, private political interest. And so once the center decides they're going out or going global, is to help resolve two systemic pressures and problems, then it instantly create throughout the rank incentives for different people, corporations and banks and ministries, bureaucracies to go out as well. So I don't want to give the impression that going global China is something that's set at the top and is controlled at the top. No. Once that is decided, it generates into all these interests that the center now has a hard time controlling. And this is so Chinese, so China, because we people who study domestic China have seen this all over in so many times, that they have the center cannot really control what is happening beyond the central level. And so we have to pay attention to all these levels, hierarchies of actors who are now, so to speak, become the foot soldiers of global China. And sometimes, and a lot of times, doing things against the interest of the central government.
And I think that that's a really important point, and one of the major misconceptions whenever I find that I'm talking to people about Belt and Road is they see that the map, right, of like Belt and Road, and here's the thing, and it seems extremely sort of coordinated, and you imagine that every time there's an investment in another country that Xi Jinping has ordered that firm to go make that specific investment, right? And of course, the reality is they create this general framework, but there's the interests become much messier. So
Yes,
anyway,
exactly.
yeah, Jenny.
Thanks. So shifting topics a little bit, but picking up on the maybe second two levels that you talked about. So both the bundle of like global China is a bundle of power relations and how it sort of functions as a set of relational power out in the world. And the third level, so China, global China as a method, and looking more specifically at Hong Kong. So Hong Kong being your hometown, first of all, and you recently returned from several years as a visiting scholar there. So I'm wondering, both thinking about global China as a method, what you could tell us about what's happened there recently, especially for those people maybe listening who haven't been following events in Hong Kong much more closely than, say, the New York Times headlines or something like that. And also ethnographically, right? So I think, one of the biggest strengths I've always taken from your work is your ability to unpack and investigate these global phenomena from a very grounded ethnographic methodology. So having had the, I guess, privilege in some sense of being on the ground in Hong Kong over the past couple of years of really dramatic political shifts and a lot of violence, what can you share with us, both sort of from the ground ethnographically, but also analytically about what's going on?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Jenny. And I think this is, especially these days, this past week, when the whole world and all of us have been watching what's happening in Ukraine. Just those images and really brought back memory to me about 2019 in Hong Kong. There is a Ukraine moment in Hong Kong during the 2019 protests. And what was that moment? What was the connection? During 2019, those 6 months of protests throughout Hong Kong, one of the most regular happenings in most districts, neighborhoods in Hong Kong was this open screen in open area. It's like, you have put up a screen, somebody would put up a screen and they would be showing what? They'll be showing a documentary now on Netflix. It's been on Netflix forever. It's called Winter on Fire. Winter on Fire is, so it's been watched and it's been used as a kind of, you can say propaganda, but also kind of inspirational material for protesters and ordinary citizens in Hong Kong, watching Ukrainians in 2013 to 14, that particularly severe winter, where people would risk their lives and many people did die, the Independence Square in Ukraine, protesting against their own president who had turned towards Putin, away from the promise to align Ukraine with the EU and NATO. And people were just, they were doing exactly what Hong Kong citizens were doing, protesting, using their bodies to try to resist an authoritarian regime. And I couldn't find a source why they chose this, but maybe it's because Netflix is widely available. But Ukraine, Winter on Fire, has become this inspirational material that my 15, 16 years old protesters that I hung out with and went to protest with, they were talking about it all the time. And so the morale, if there is this tremendous morale sustaining the movement in Hong Kong in those days, one of the reasons was watching Ukrainians defending their hometown, their home country. And that's exactly the spirit that stays with me. I mean, you asked me the ethnographic kind of findings I have. I mean, I think there's no other way of understanding what the protesters were doing in Hong Kong unless you were part of it. You were part of the process and being able to understand why for those 15 years olds or teenagers or the young people, they were born after the British left. They were born when Hong Kong has entered the so-called post-colonial, that is the British colonialists have left. And Hong Kong was supposed to be autonomous, will have their Hong Kong people running their own affair that was promised by the British and China in an international treaty. And this is the generation, the post-colonial generation, taking post-colonialism much more seriously than anybody else and than any country and than other generations. And they acquire this capacity and subjectivity as post-colonial generation. And so this is the same sentiment you see. People, of course, in Ukraine is the whole country, is cross-generation. You see people, it's not the tank man, it's the whole village coming to stop the tank. But that sentiment of defending your homeland is universal. And I think this is the lens that I hope people outside of China and even in China should be able to appreciate. This is the sense of a home, defending your homeland, a place that you belong, and not about internationally recognized jurisdiction. I think this, again, where the nation state is very dangerous, this idea, because the nation state blinds people. I mean, look at the US reaction to Ukraine, as opposed to US reaction to Hong Kong, because most people think of Hong Kong as part of China. So it's a domestic affair. You don't think of Hong Kong people as fighting for their homeland because, well, you're part of China. So it's a dispute, domestic dispute. And China likes the world to see it that way. But then the local perspective is lost in that sense. So that's the ethnographic thing that I like to share with you. There are all these other things that I can talk about, the mobilization, and the sense of, an end game because of the 2047 deadline for one country and two systems. That's going into too much detail. I don't want to, I know many of the audience may not be familiar with it. I don't want to go there. But I want to answer the question of what does a global China perspective help us to see in the situation of Hong Kong? I think two main things. First, what happens to Hong Kong is part of a global China phenomenon, in the sense that what I have seen in Zambia, that is how China tries to those three power mechanisms that I mentioned as constitutive of global China, I find them in Zambia, but also in Hong Kong. And it is so striking because nobody would compare Zambia with Hong Kong. One is a copper giant, and the image I have is copper mines. And then Hong Kong is the financial center. One is the most poorest country in the world, the other is one of the most wealthy. One is copper giant, the other is a global financial center. What do they have in common? Nothing, except the three mechanisms of global China. I find their parallel existence in these two places. And that was the moment. And when I think, well, okay, well, actually, what we see in Hong Kong is not unique to Hong Kong. All those white elephant infrastructure projects, I find them in Africa too. Well, why? Well, because China has to export all this surplus capacity, whether it's Hong Kong or Zambia. Patron clientelism, they try to plant their own politicians and elites, groom them in exchange for economic or political benefits. The same thing happens. And then you have Confucius Institute in Zambia. But in Hong Kong, Beijing actually transformed the whole curriculum of history books, going deeper, but the same mechanism of symbolic domination, control of the media in both places. So what we can see through the lens of global China is that it is systemic. It is something that is pushing China to do. And it's not just because it wants to control Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of this bigger global process. So that's the power aspect of it. Now, the other thing I learned about Hong Kong, and I think has general lessons for global China, is the resistance part. The resistance is, of course, the movements that we have observed, the world has borne witness to. Hong Kong resistance to protest against China, I would say, is one extreme example, in a spectrum of resistance to global China. For many reasons, it is the most energetic and powerful resistance to global China. But if we think in terms of resistance to global China, as I said, there is one side who wants to dominate, the other side who may resist. Is a relationship, right? Domination and resistance, domination and negotiation, domination and appropriation and adaptation. What Hong Kong shows is one extreme of reaction or counter movements to global China that is constitutive of global China. And for a lot of reasons, Hong Kong has put up the most feisty kind of resistance, but it's just one example and one type of resistance that we should consider in understanding global China. In Zambia, the workers, the laborers, in my book I wrote about more strikes in Chinese mines than other international mines. They put up their own struggle. The Zambian elite appropriate Chinese investment in the mining sector, but not so in the concessional loan sector. But Hong Kong's resistance is just, a bigger, a magnified, amplified example of the farmers in Sri Lanka protesting against taking their land away to build that Hambantatu port that has been in the news a lot. So I think what Hong Kong resistance reminds us about global China is that, yes, China is doing a lot to try to be coercive and repressive and throw its weight around. But we shouldn't forget that wherever it goes, it has triggered different kinds and different levels, different intensity of reaction by both the elite and ordinary citizen. And we can, if people are interested, I can go into talking about Hong Kong, but I don't think this talk is about Hong Kong, why Hong Kong has been able to put up such a fight, whereas in Zambia is more muted. But comparing Hong Kong with other places where global China has left footprint or has gone into, I think Hong Kong is the situation where we really want to use the term colonialism. And in this case, of course, internal colonialism, because only in Hong Kong, I really haven't found other cases around the world that I'm aware of where China has an impact only in Hong Kong have you found that the institutions, all major institutions, have now been transplanted and replaced by mainland Chinese ones. And we're talking about the political system, the education system, the media, the law, the legal system is almost non-existent. The common law system, the way national security law has totally terrorized even the judges and the legal and the lawyers and as such. The media, I mean, every civil servants, I mean, any long-standing Hong Kong local institution has been replaced. And this is the moment when I would use the term colonialism, and not just in terms of, oh, how much your GDP is because trade with China, or even how much loans you have got from the Chinese government. It's about institutional transplant, because once you transplant your institutions in another society, you basically control the levers of power, both coercive and machinery of consent, who don't need to go to school, right? And then your kids were subject to this educational system from textbooks to the right to people with tenure. Now they're attacking people with tenure. I mean, I myself have been part of the attack, but after me, many of my colleagues now are on the run, literally. Many have left overnight because they've been attacked. So I think Hong Kong is really an extreme example of resistance, but also an extreme example of global China power. And luckily, I haven't seen it being replicated in other parts of the world where China has a presence.
It's interesting. Just yesterday, Darren Byler was here at Cornell giving a talk on Xinjiang. He doesn't use the term global China, but he is very much situating some of the, I think, also straightforwardly colonial practices that we see there within this global context, and thinking about the relationship to the global war on terror, global capitalism, production of goods, et cetera. It's a different situation than Hong Kong for all sorts of reasons, but in terms of the remaking of some of the particular institutions of education, of religion, et cetera, there are some parallels there. I do want to just mention that we're going to leave enough time for some Q&A, and I see that a few folks have already left questions in the Q&A, and you should feel free to write them in there. I want to ask a question now, which is basically the inverse of the first question I asked you. So the first question being, why is China going out? And the question is now, is China coming back in, or to what extent, right? So we do know that after 2018, there was a dramatic decline in the outgoing investment from China. There have been all sorts of other indicators, right? The government preventing companies from listing on foreign stock exchanges. This has, of course, all been very intensified by COVID-19. The borders are, for all intents and purposes, closed to foreigners. Xi Jinping has announced this idea of dual circulation, which says, well, we're going to have internal economic circulation and still global circulation, right? But the pretty clear emphasis in dual circulation is we need to build up our domestic capacity to make China more resilient. And I think given all of the sanctions that are being levied against Russia right now, that will give them only sort of more pressure to ensure that they can exist economically independent of Western technology and finance, et cetera. So there are some signs that China is pulling back. Do you think that this is a real kind of secular change, or is this just kind of a blip and COVID will end and we'll kind of go back to that old trajectory? And what do you think the implications of this are for our understanding of global China?
Right. Yes, there's been reports about this reverse trend. Well, I can make a few observations here. First of all, the word deglobalization has been around, and the economists have run several important stories several years back, but particularly since the pandemic. And so this deglobalization as a trend, not that overnight we won't have any more global integration, but the trend of going the other way from globalization and what they call deglobalization. It is not just about China. It is the whole world trying to, reconsider the appropriate or optimal level of global integration, just for the sake of self-protection, national interest, how to become less vulnerable to any disruptions of the global supply chain. So first of all, the first point I would say is China is just part of this global trend of thinking about rethinking and readjusting and trying to, mitigate its exposure to a very uncertain world. I mean, the US is doing it. Brexit is to a certain extent about this. And the COVID just exacerbated the vulnerability that we're all aware of. So first is global. China is reacting to this in a global way and taking clues from other countries. Second, and even before the world talks about deglobalization, I remember it was, again, several years after 2008, the financial crisis, that you heard lots of economists within China talking about the need to rebalance the economy, shifting it back to emphasizing more domestic consumption. So it was 10 years before 2018, the date that you mentioned, that there's already after 2008, and that's why I think it's a critical moment of paradigm shift for the Chinese leaderships, that you need to rebalance your domestic economy way before COVID and way before this trade war and Trump and all the rest of it. And so the second thing I want to make is that China already realizes they can't really depend on the export model forever, regardless of anything happening outside. So I think it's rebalancing, readjustment is like a stock market. From time to time, they need to readjust. And I don't see any sign that this is a signal for a great reset button to be pushed by Beijing at the top that would call back everything that has gone out. And even if they wanted to push that reset button, and given our analysis of all these foot soldiers, they're motivated by their own interests, those loans that are at least 20 years old, long repayment period, and those mines, by the way, the mines that I spent a lot of time in, they are for 99 years, 50 to 99 years. The special economic zones and some of those concessions in the mining sectors, they are long-term. They can't just be called back. Well, you could, but you stand to lose. So, and let alone those projects that are still ongoing. So I think if this was the beginning of the reverse trend of China of a deglobalized China, it will take a long time for that to come to any substantial level of reality, that these forces that Beijing has unleashed would be, returning home and really, being stopped from having any effect outside of China. So, and by the way, the report so far we've heard about China looking inward, mostly it seems like government policies have so far focused on the cultural domain. So it's like about consumption, it's about not celebrating foreign holidays like Christmas. It's about not allowing people to go to go through the VPN, to go beyond the Great China Firewall. It's more about culture, not so much about economic activities. And not yet, I'm not sure where it will go. But the final observation I have, and this is something that if you read the Financial Times, it would still convince me that whatever Beijing says, the political leader says, Wall Street is something different. They behave differently. All these 2 years, if you look at what the Financial Times has reported very regularly, the amount of money going from Wall Street, the investment banks, investment firms, going into China, they hit record volume. In the past few years, exactly when we were talking about this decoupling, deglobalization, and trade war and everything. So Washington, Beijing may have one rhetoric, and when it comes to real money, big money, it seems there is a whole different kind of marriage going on. coupling going on. And so these two levels, they're like parallel universes, but we should be mindful of that and not be too taken away by just one level of reality and one rhetoric.
So I'd like to move to the questions that have been put in the Q&A. I'm mindful of time. We've already gotten some really good comprehensive questions. Please, if you haven't and you'd like to submit one, please do. So I think I'd like to actually maybe pull out the second question about gender relations, because I don't think we've talked about that. So the question is really asking, as China rises to power on the global stage, what are your comments on the changing role of women in China, both domestically and in the context of global China?
This I think I can't say much because I haven't seen very good research on gender relations lately. It's just not the lens that researchers have been using. And everything I've heard that has to do with gender and women's situation in China, and some of the forthcoming books that my colleagues have asked me to read before they're published, all suggest from divorce courts to, human trafficking. Women are still in very terrible shape as a group. Ethan Michelson will have a very thick, big book that is the book to go to if you want to look at women's situation in the divorce court system, and is really, really depressing findings. No matter how good the law looks, and women still, many of them were just sort of imprisoned by the system not to get divorced from very abusive husbands. And it's not just a minority of cases, but it's the whole system set up that subjugate them, to deprive them of equal right before the law. And then we still, during the Olympics, I'm sure you and I have both heard of horrific cases of just years and years of women being sold multiple times as sex slaves in some rural areas, giving birth to 8 children, while the woman herself was locked by chain around her neck, tied to a pole, and being fed, and she was so sick and have lost all her teeth. That had made really sensational news within China, and it was something that had received a crackdown by the government because it was during Olympics and the Winter Olympics, and the government just doesn't really want the world to see the news, but it got out. And so, these are the pieces that I get together that women's situation is still a very dismal state within China. Global China, it's very hard to use gender lens to look at global China. Well, you can document how many women and men, the gender balance of people going abroad. But I would say that there has not much been very important transformation in terms of gender relations and power and opportunities. What I've seen, I myself observed in the mines and construction industry, these are male-dominated industries, the Belt and Road. These industries facilitate, by nature of it being male-dominated at home, when they go out, they basically transport the whole, they export the whole kind of gender hierarchy out. And of course, women managers, but they are far and away very minorities. And so, so I just want to flesh it out. I think it's a good research topic. I encourage young scholars, PhD students to look into that. But I myself haven't seen any solid comprehensive work that look at global China from a gender perspective.
Okay, I'll take the next question in the Q&A. This is from Jack Zinda, and he's talking about the global China perspective. He says he really appreciates it, and yet in many ways it's a critique that critical development studies has offered for decades beyond methodological nationalism, surveillance capitalism, global hegemony. So my question is, why does critical development studies need global China as a frame or as a method? Is Global China simply applying the existing tools of critical development studies to current conjunctures, or infusing insights from China studies into these conversations? Or do you see this approach fundamentally changing development studies in some way?
Well, I don't know how much critical development study has made into development studies and into the larger body of knowledge that social scientists work with. In China studies itself, I mean, I'm not seeing, I mean, China studies is a big field, but because China is so big and there's a lot of essentialization going on through the generations about China. So this essentialist view about China is still very dominant. And there are all these institutional support that you build a career as a China scholar and you just focus on China. And so, and could build a career, and then you reproduce yourself, your students would adopt the same kind of style of scholarship. And I think, well, if critical development studies is already there, fine, and by all means apply your tools to study China. But if you look around, people studying global China, they are not, they're still very much thinking in terms of China going abroad, and let's see what China is doing. I would say comparing China with with other countries outside of China is rare. Now, that small step, that is comparing China and other countries' global practices itself is the baby step, but is not done regularly. I don't know the development field. Maybe the critical development scholars are way ahead of our time, but I would appreciate, you point me to some titles or books that use that perspective on China, and it's just not done. I mean, by the way, I would be very careful with any disciplines with the word critical, because a lot of times what that means is that you sit in your room and you can criticize without doing the real hard work of really doing the hard work of comparison. Doing ethnography is hard enough. Anyone who has done it know it. Doing comparative ethnography means you have to do twice, if not 3 times, 4 times as much as an ethnography to have that kind of grounded comparative perspective. And if critical development studies means doing that kind of work, I'm all for it. But I've also seen things that are called critical, means that you sit in your office and you criticize A and B and C not doing, debunking the concept, deconstruct the concept that you use. I mean, if that means critical, I think I'd rather have methodological nationalism where people still go to a country and look at what is happening. So I'm not qualified. What I'm saying is I'm not qualified to comment on what critical development studies have proposed or have produced, but I think there are good logistical resource reasons why comparative global transnational work with real ethnographic empirical teeth is hard to come by, is because it is really, really laborious and time consuming, and it just goes against the institutional timeline of how long it will take for you to go through your PhD, how many years before you come up for tenure, and how long the research grants would support you. I mean, all these are institutional reasons for working against the kind of scholarship we like to see. And but I'm just saying that, yes, great. I mean, if there is already a field of critical development studies, then we should read more about it and translate those ideas into in-depth empirical comparative research on the ground.
So if I can maybe pick up on a couple of threads that you've already been discussing somewhat implicitly, and also a thread that Ryan poses. He has a couple of questions here, but I want to pull out one of them that mentions Russia. You talked a bit about Ukraine and just the parallels and connections sort of ethnographically you see between what happened in Ukraine and Hong Kong. And I'm wondering, again, this is probably a bit of a speculation on your part, which I think is fair in this sort of unraveling series of events we've seen just over the past week, and it's changing every 12 hours, it's like. But taking a global China perspective and maybe picking up on what you were just talking about comparison, what could your sort of knowledge of China as a global phenomenon and both a global economic player, right, on the kind of current geopolitical stage, it's been clear that China has been a partner to Russia in some ways, but also maybe wary of making too much out of that partnership given the current violence that Russia's been displaying. It comes up a lot in context in relation to, could China do this to Taiwan? Would we see a parallel or analogous situation happening there? Taiwan now seems potentially very afraid of having the sort of same invasion. What do we make about all this, right? I think given that it's probably on everyone's mind, like what could we learn from China? How is China maybe looking at the situation unfolding? How might they capitalize on it or see themselves as a geopolitical actor in the kind of what seems to be this great churn that's going on globally right now?
Yeah, I'm sure Beijing is watching very intensely and carefully at what is unfolding because of his very belligerent and aggressive stance it has made, particularly by Xi Jinping himself towards Taiwan. And all this is not just talk. I mean, they really have military exercises and whatnot to show their powers in the strait. So I think a lot depends on how the world reacts against Putin. I don't want to say Russia because a lot of Russians are against the war. It's really a Putin's war. But given the strong reaction and pushback and the sanctions, and it's like all around, from some cat associations to football and to all kinds of civil society actors are now lining up against Putin. I think Xi Jinping got the message that the world would not let a bully destroy the international rule-based order, and to attack a sovereign country is not acceptable. And I think he is getting this message, which we're all seeing being sent to Putin. And as a result, I think China would not dare even go there. I mean, literally and figuratively, to think about an attack, a real attack on Taiwan to so-called peacefully or not so peacefully reunify the country. But the other fronts of this war, two other fronts that are very important also, is the financial war. The suspension of SWIFT for Russian banks. I think China and Russia they have been talking about how to build up their own financial market so that even if they're disconnected or decoupled from the US dominated SWIFT system, then they could still survive as a bloc. So we'll have to observe how the financial warfare side play out, not just the military side. The third front of this war that I think China will be observing very carefully is the informational war front. This time, social media plays a big role in rallying support, in letting the world know that Ukrainians are not putting down so easily. They're not, declaring or surrendering. And the bravery and those social media really is an informational war this time. And I think China will be observing that and try to, make sure that it is in control of that if it comes to waging any aggression at home or abroad. And so I think military, information, and finance will be the things that China will be observing very carefully, whether a power as strong as Russia and as autocratic as Putin will be able to withstand the backlash if he decides to do anything against the popular will. yeah, so that's what I think Beijing is and what we should be observing as well.
Thanks. So shifting gears somewhat significantly, we have a question in the chat that comes from Evelyn, and she says that she really appreciates your effort in taking seriously the perspective of African people. And then she says, I'm wondering, during your fieldwork, did you try to look for any comparison between African people's views of China today and that of their grandparents, looking at past colonial powers?
I have many occasions in Zambia when my African respondents, sometimes friends, talk to me about their own view. I mean, these people were not 20-something teenagers, but they themselves, who came of age in the 60s when they were young, they had a very fond memory of those times, of China in those times, because they remember, of course, Tazara, I mean, the railroad the Chinese built using Chinese money and manpower and engineers, built for Tanzania and Zambia. It's called a Freedom Railroad because it liberated Zambia's dependence on the rail through white-dominated right route Zimbabwe to export is copper. And so in Zambia in particular, maybe not so much in the rest of Africa, Zambia and Tanzania have long been China's old friends because of Mao's willingness and contribution to building that railroad. And my friends in Zambia, they remember very fondly that it was really a game changer to have that railroad built by the Chinese. But they also, beyond the railroad, they also remember that they were able to afford imports or export, however you call it, but things from China, commodities from China, like soap, everyday commodities, things that they used in their everyday life coming from China. They were cheap enough for them to afford. And so they improved. China for them is a place where you can buy goods that you could use and you could afford and improve your quality of life. And that's still the image that stays with a lot of ordinary Africans, not the lofty development model. Those are not what people get. It's really bicycles that they were able to use, going from one place to these everyday necessities that Chinese made, because countries are so poor and Chinese goods were almost always the most affordable ones. And of course, only since the 90s did the world, American consumers realize that, well, Chinese goods are widely available and lifting the living standard of working class people in the US and Europe. But the Africans knew it way, way before Western consumers, because Maoist China had very vibrant trade relations with several African countries, with the Eastern European countries as well. So those countries, the people there, they've experienced China as the workshop of the world, like several decades before the rest of us have experienced. And by the way, also, I should also mention that because Chinese people are not white people, and this racialized image of colonialism stays very strongly among Africans. So as soon as they see a non-white face, their association with colonialism is mediated, is not as sharp and direct. So there's a lot of ambivalence in how to think about the Chinese, because, well, they're not white, so that means they're not colonialists, because colonialist is associated with being white. On the other hand, the Chinese come with lots of money, but they were poor not long ago. So how should we categorize the Chinese? They're not your conventional, they don't fit that category, that classification of colonialists. So there's a lot of ambivalence. Of course, many people are aware that China would become the next colonialists, but they are not yet. And then they have all these features that don't fit that conventional. One thing that I realized a lot working in the mines is because I went into the mines, underground mines, in the Chinese mine, in the Indian mines, South African mines, Canadian mines. I went there for ethnographic work. And my African miners were telling me, and they said, only the Chinese managers and engineers would get their hands dirty and actually go down to the underground mines. And you see them. The Indians wouldn't go. Indians, South Africans, Canadians, they stay in the air-conditioned rooms. And so that also make the Chinese that, yeah, they were managers. They were supposed to exploit us and whatnot. But they also come to labor together with us. So it's all these skin color and the practice of the Chinese that make them very ambiguous categories in the mindset of the Africans with reference to white colonialism in their history.
I think we might have time for just one more question, and I'll ask one from the chat that Ding posed. Maybe a nice one to end on. How can you share your insights and advice about teaching global China and doing fieldwork in or on China in a time of US-Chinese tension and with all of the other dynamics going on within China?
Yeah, actually, this is a good question because I'm actually teaching a global China undergrad class right now. And I think it is the best time to teach it because people are aware of the tension and they're curious how to think through and how to handle this tension, both for the Chinese students, international students, but also for American students, because there's no way of avoiding China and Chinese power in the everyday life. And I think that interest, that level of interest is there, is ready, they're primed to discussions about global China. And today I also have Darren coming to talk to me, my class about Xinjiang, and everybody was so, they were extremely attracted to the topic because it's in the news. And then at the end, we also realized that Xinjiang, the making of Xinjiang is the making of global capitalism and the global war on terror and global racialization and subjugation of Muslim populations. So all these would come together very well. And it allows the opportunity, the way I teach it is also to use China to look back at the United States, all the things, human rights issues. I mean, we all have human rights issue in this country. And so there's some truth to it when China puts up this rebuttal against US accusation of its human rights violation. And then the position is, if both countries have problems with human rights, does it mean that we can't criticize each other? Well, of course not. I mean, we should criticize both instead of not criticizing anybody. Anyway, so I think this is very brief answer to your question. I think this is exactly the right time. If we maintain a fact-based, logical, and kind of unbiased position to lay out the debate and the issues and the facts on both sides. So I really enjoy teaching it this quarter. I will continue to do it. I think it's even better than just teach a kind of contemporary domestic China class. It's much more relevant to the students.
Okay, that was perfect timing and an extremely illuminating conversation. I wish we had more time because there are plenty more questions coming in. Maybe we will be able to share it with you offline. But thank you so much, CK, and thank you both Eli and Jenny for making this possible. Hayes too, who's behind the scenes, been helping us with much of the technical support and the logistical support for this webinar. Okay, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Fuad.